once we'd had the initial Sun story, we asked people to come forward.
Yes.
That is now closed.
Right.
Because it's a simple situation from a leadership point of view, which is once we'd got offered the resignation with no payoff, if you looked at any possible sanctions, someone leaving the BBC without a payoff is where it sits. So you make that decision, and that's where we are. Now, clearly, there's the learnings and all the things we've got to do in the review, which I'm sure we can talk about, but that's where we are with regard to the investigations.
Okay, and it's not something that you would have any intention of making public or any aspect of it?
No, my instincts are always to be as transparent as I can. I know that always causes questions, but I think when you've got an internal disciplinary process within an organisation to get into absolute specifics where individuals have raised concerns, I don't think is appropriate, and that I think is right. Okay. I would say, Chair, I think it's worth saying that I also said on the record that if in the process of any disciplinary investigation we found anything of a very serious nature or criminal or anything of that type, we would of course refer it to the police and we would be in a completely different situation. That is not what came through any of the work we did.
Okay.
Okay. So anything that we clearly got things progressing outside the workplace, but we're very clear with regard to where we are within the workplace.
Okay, which neatly takes me to my next question, which is sort of at the point at which last November, when you were informed confidentially by the police of Mr. Edwards' arrest, you took the decision then not to take any further action against him, and I know you're on the record as saying that you were committed to take action if he was charged whilst he remained an employee. Was there anything that had emerged, either through the internal investigation or through any other route, about his conduct that you took into account at that time in your own decision? So not what the police were informing you, separate to the police investigation. I just wondered at that point.
No, I don't think anything there was material in that decision. The decision was absolutely about the case that the police were, giving us very clear instruction to keep confidential, as is again well documented and well reported. We knew the category. We had no knowledge at all of the specifics, and the decision, which I stand by the way, was made in terms of to remain with the suspension. The guidelines are clear in terms of our policies, but also more generally that you pay someone under suspension. We could debate that, and that's the decision we made. And you also are aware that we made a limited number of people aware as per the police's instructions. So I think we behaved in good faith throughout and made the reasonable decisions.
And I know that in the statement that the board issued on the 9th of August, having discussed in great detail, I assume, in board meetings, the decision that you made at that time, that the board is satisfied with the way in which you took account of all of these different matters. I guess the one question there's a specific question here, which is whether you had an option at that time, as in November last year, to sort of do anything in terms of the pay, his pay status, bearing in mind now the attempt to recover the pay that has been made in the period since. Could you, and did you want to do anything about his pay status, as in could you have kept him suspended without pay as opposed to at full pay? Because I noticed in the statement the board has issued that one of the things they've asked you to look at is whether is the sort of BBC's pay policy when employees are suspended.
Indeed. I mean, as I said, it wasn't an easy decision. It was really difficult getting the balance right, because you knew that the arrest had been made, you knew that there were no charges. In that, you take advice, and you can always take risk, by the way. You can take risk in these situations and go against your policies. Being blunt, you can take the risk. There might be legal risks in that. There also might be significant welfare risks, because you've also got vulnerable individuals And, you know, obviously your primary thoughts are people who are impacted, but also you've got people who are accused at that point, and you don't know whether they're going to result in charges. So you have a lot of unknowns at that point. If you look at, I mean, I even looked at the gov.uk guidelines on employee rights during suspension, and the standard practice is to pay. Now, you know, this affair has not been easy for any of us at the BBC, and particularly for those people who have been impacted. But I think it's absolutely right to look back and reflect and say, what are the learnings here? This is standard practice, but maybe we should be challenging that. And that's what I'm sure the Chair will want to speak about, what the board's role is in all this and their oversight. But I welcome the idea that we look at that policy and see with, you know, hindsight is a wonderful thing. With that, you begin to think about, could you be more muscular in that situation with regard to payment? That's where we are.
Okay. Just before I come on to Dr. Shah, can I just ask, just in terms of looking back and lessons from that period, before I move on to sort of, as I say, the role of the board. I mean, is there anything else that you would reflect on? I mean, for example, at the point at which you were approached last summer by The Sun when this story first emerged, is there anything at that point that you might reflect on? Thinking about sort of whether or not, there was a... when these kind of scandals are brought to you, how much how much of this do you perceive as an institutional attack versus an inquiry about something which is a serious issue to do with one of your employees?
I've always taken I've leant towards the latter, Chair, okay, because I always think, you know, the press will have an agenda, but at the end of the day, I think you need to deal with things seriously, and the people affected in this. So I don't get, being very open about it, I don't get too bent out of shape by the press going at it. I'm interested in whether the BBC did the right thing, and if we did the right thing and we're acting calmly and in good faith within the right, you know, then that's what my job is. I think throughout the affair we have acted in good faith, and I think we've tried to make, you know, sensible calls with the right judgment throughout. I think there are inevitably, in answer to your question, do I reflect? Of course I reflect. These are difficult things for an institution, and I think it's really important we reflect. There are some specifics. So we have done a review of non-editorial complaints, and when there's various ways in which you can come into the BBC, whether you've got someone just turning up at a reception or ringing in a line, is that coordinated? Has it? And we did a review with, as you know, with Deloitte on what's called non-editorial complaints, which is when just someone comes with an issue that isn't related to our output. We've done an enormous amount of work on that, and there are some learnings in terms of joining up the BBC. We can get into some really gritty specifics on what we've done on that. So there has been some learnings on that. The second is the areas we've talked about in terms of some of the ins and outs of this. I think our policies are fit for purpose, but there's things you reflect on, like the debate we've just been having around payment. And then we can talk about the board. There's clearly this ongoing question, which I think this industry continually needs to work on, and I believe we've made massive progress here. This idea of power in the workplace, and just, are we in the right place on that? And just, that will be, to change culture, and there's many people around the room who've done this takes time, and I think you reflect on how far you've come on that journey. And how much progress you've made. So yeah, there's lots of reflection. Okay.
I'm sure, Dr. Shaw, you might want to refer to the review that was also announced in the statement that the board issued in August about this review on the sort of balance of power. But could I ask more specifically about reflecting on the role of the board in this situation? Both during the time since you've been as chair, and I realise that this started before you arrived, but are you satisfied with the visibility of the board in handling a crisis such as this? For instance, there was a period between it becoming known of Huw Edwards' arrest and your statement, but we also had the situation again this year, which was similar to that which occurred when this story first broke last year, where different Secretary of State, different government, different chairman, but we've got the government going straight to the Director General, wanting to ask perfectly reasonable questions, but seeking almost to hold the Director General to account, and the people are unaware what the board is doing at that time.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Before I answer both the question on visibility and the relationship between the Secretary of State and the Director General, may I make some observations from the point of view of the board about this affair? The first thing I would say is that it's my view and the view of the board that there's nothing more important than public trust in the BBC, and we are custodians of that trust. And what Huw Edwards did damaged the reputation and the trust for the BBC, so we take that very seriously indeed. I should say, it was a shock to discover when it was announced, when he was charged, that he had led this double life. On the face of it, a trusted news presenter, but hidden secretly, he was this figure who did the most appalling things. I mean, let's not forget the victims of this. Those are the children in those pictures.
I'm sort of nervous to interrupt, but I'm just conscious as well about the sub judice point that I raised at the beginning of this hearing.
Let me make a wider point. I want to be clear that the person who betrayed the trust of the nation, the trust of his colleagues, was Huw Edwards. I knew him. I worked with him 30 years ago. Many producers, researchers, directors, editors worked with Huw Edwards, made him the figure he was, and they feel angry and betrayed by him. I think we need to say that. I also want to say from the board point of view, as you know, on the day he had pleaded guilty, I asked him and his team to give me an account of the decisions they took in the course of that year. We then reviewed those decisions, and we believe, as Tim has said, and we said in our statement, that the decisions Tim and his team took were made in good faith. These were very complicated decisions, and given the evidence available to them at the time, they made reasonable decisions based on the evidence. So we supported it, and we continue to support it. That's not to say, as Tim said, there aren't lessons to be learned, and Tim has already identified a few. Let me, I could take you through the timeline, but let me talk to you about the visibility.
Yes, because I think, obviously in the interest of time, I mean, what the critical thing is, as you make clear in the statement, we know that you're satisfied, but it's that everybody else was unaware.
Let me just take you through the process, how long it took. It was I have a timeline here, on the 31st of July, a Wednesday, when Huw Edwards pleaded guilty. That afternoon, I invited the executive to write a note to the board. The board met, and we met a couple of times. We had a couple of notes. We went through in great detail. We went through the board, and we decided that we supported the decisions taken by Tim and his team, but we also felt there was a genuine issue here about the abuse of power, and it was worth examining that. We've done it many times. We can talk about the many reviews we've had, but abuse of power is not limited to the BBC. It's not a thing that's ever done. It's constantly a problem, and we need to constantly be vigilant about it. I can talk more about the terms of reference and to it. Now, from the moment of the pleading of guilty on the Wednesday to the board agreed statement, which was Thursday night, the following Thursday night, was produced on Friday morning. In my view, that's not a long time. We had to take a lot of evidence. I had to talk to all the board members individually, what their thought was. We had 2 board meetings. We had Tim and his team writing 2 deep papers about it. Seems to me to take 7 days to come up with a statement is not bad going. So I don't really agree with you that we were slow on this. I could take you in detail every single step.
I don't think it's so much that I'm questioning the length of time that the board took in order to discharge its responsibilities. The question I'm getting to is the visibility and the transparency of the role of the board in holding the Director General to account and the Secretary of State stepping in the absence, it seems to the public, of anybody else holding the Director General to account. And because I'm conscious of time and because we've got so much else to get to, I just wondered if you could give us your view as to whether you might seek to be
on
more
the visibility,
transparent.
The board statement was a public document about what we felt about the actions Tim Davey and his team have taken and what we were going to do in forward. The Secretary of State conversation, I don't think it's right to present it as holding him to account. The Secretary of State is free to call whoever she would like to do. I think if the conversation is about information, I don't have a problem about that. It's relaxed. I don't think it's about accountability. Tim, and I understand what accountability is. Tim is accountable to me. But if the Secretary of State wants to know what's going on, I'm perfectly relaxed with conversations that may take place. But we need to be clear where accountability is. And Tim's accountability is to the chair and the board. And I think that was clear. And what the conversation that took place, remember, it was reported as summons. That was a press thing. It wasn't actually. Tim ended up having a phone call conversation about what's going on. As I said, Tim often speaks to the Secretary of State, and that's fine, as long as we know what it's about. It's about information and about what's going, but not about holding somebody to account. It's my job to hold the Director General to account. I think that's clear.
Okay, thank you. I guess what the point that I'm trying to sort of make here is that the role of the chair and the board is also to uphold, I think as is made clear in the statement that you issued, the public trust and confidence in the BBC, and the visibility of that being, it's where accountability to the licence fee payers sits at a time like this, and that's the that's the critical sort of point, really. But I mean, you've answered the question. And if there's anything more particularly that you wanted to say on accountability to licence fee payers and the role of the board in these sort of situations that we haven't had a chance to cover and you want to come back to me or follow up in writing, I'm very happy to do that. I just want to ask one further question, which is around the BBC archive in relation to Huw Edwards. And what I understand from reports that there have been some steps taken already to deal with some footage. I just wonder if you could just give to Mr. Davey, if you could just give us a sense of how you are handling this. What is the approach going to be?
I think some of the reporting hasn't been quite on the money, actually, because we don't remove or delete anything from the archive, what sits in our BBC archive, unless we have a legal order to do so. That's a technicality, and we haven't. I don't think we've got on at this point, so it sits in the archive. What is broadcast or appears on iPlayer is then a matter of editorial judgment in terms of what is appropriate. Yeah, and in the real world, you don't have 100 of these examples. We'll have, is that the appropriate documentary? Frankly, should this individual be seen presenting the Queen's death? All we do is, in these sensitive cases, make sure that that's got the right level of oversight and act in a common sense way. That is what we are doing. So there's no wholesale banning. We're not sitting in the archive deleting files of individuals. Those remain in the archive, but I think it's absolutely appropriate when someone's been involved in a case like this, which is active, so we should be careful, but we make decisions based on that. And of course, we've just got we're not trying to, the BBC is about, it stands for everything that isn't censorship. So I think my instinct is where there's editorial justification, even when that's uncomfortable, some of this footage may emerge, but it's got to be in the right situation. We've got good experience of that, Chair, in terms of various affairs through the past and also public events. So that's where we are.
Okay, so any concerns that have been expressed by people that some of these very, very important historic events that have involved Huw Edwards are not going to be somehow digitally altered in a way that would be unacceptable?
I haven't got around to a proposal for digital alteration, Chair. I've just simply...
Whatever the case may be.
Sitting in the archive and making judgments, common sense judgment based on the editorial occasion that arises.
Okay. All right. This is a subject which we could pursue at great length, which I'm sure the CMS Select Committee in the Commons will probably wish to do so once they are formed and able to take evidence. We will at this point move to the other areas of questioning that we want to pursue, which I said at the beginning relates very much to the inquiry report we published a couple of years ago and how things have developed. And you know, in that as well, I mean, we're asking a lot of our questions from the perspective as well of ensuring that the BBC is operating in a way which is to the satisfaction of all licence fee payers. So there may be things in response to some of the other questions that we put to you, Dr. Shaw, that you might want to come back on some of that theme in terms of, you know, actually addressing licence fee payer issues. But I will ask the Lord Bishop to get us going.
Thank you. We're going to look at revenue and the impact of falling revenue. It's very clear from the stats around that BBC revenue faces long-term decline. Doesn't look like a blip as the number of licence fee payers continues to fall, for example. How are you responding to this in the short and medium and long term? And does this in any way affect the viability of the ambitions that you set out in the BBC for the Future strategy?
Lord Bishop, thank you for that question. I will come back to Tim when we talk about the short-term response to the decline in licence fee. I think that issue speaks to a wider point about the future funding model of the BBC and what that should be. And if you allow me, Chair, just to make a couple of opening statements about that, and about this, because this is the first time I've spoken in public, I'd like to make the point that, in my view, the BBC has an enormously important role to play in the social and cultural life of this country. It does come in for a lot of flack, and sometimes that's well merited, but it is undeniably a force for good, and it faces formidable challenges in the changing media landscape. The BBC is worth fighting for, and what Tim said, laid out, seems to be one of its core points. What is its purpose? And I'm very clear that in this world of misinformation and fake information, the BBC's commitment to impartial journalism is incredibly important. In this world where global streamers are making programs for a global audience, the BBC's desire to make programs that reflect the lives of people of this country is also very important. And finally, in a fragmented society, the BBC's role as an instrument of social cohesion is also, those three things are what make the BBC unique and special and worth fighting for. To be able to do that, to your point, Lord Bishop, we need a funding model that enables us to deliver that vision in the long term. Now, there are many funding models, and there are many aspects to it. The way I perceive both in terms of strategic intent of the BBC is to see the extent to which we can strengthen the independence of the BBC. I look at the licence fee and its adaptation or its change through that lens as much as all the other ones about progression, as well as, and we may come to it later, about charter renewal. What matters most of all is the independence of the BBC. Now, any new funding model needs to ensure that we remain independent. And may I just say that the licence fee, which has many difficulties as we know, I know in my experience looking at it, that the licence fee has been vulnerable to actions by the government, particularly the Chancellor, to impose on the BBC duties that just basically take money away from making content. Most egregiously, the World Service, which, in a stroke of a pen, with no democratic accountability, no reference to Parliament, no reference to people, we suddenly had to find 300 million, which came out of the licence fee. We need to find a settlement of a future funding model that ensures we are independent of that kind of action. Now, I think we do need to be accountable, and we can come to the kind of accountability we need, but I do believe independence, we should think about the funding model in terms of independence. And in terms of short term and the decline of the licence fee, Tim had some very good data on how to deal with it.
We'll come to Tim in a moment, but I just want to press home. I think what you've given us is, if you like, a philosophical defence of the the BBC, but the question is about how are you responding to the long-term decline. Now, saying we need new funding models, I think is pretty obvious. We all agree with that. But what are you looking at?
Well, I don't take the counsel of despair that we're lost in this world. As I said, the articulation of what the BBC is for gives it a purpose. And we need a funding model that enables us to deliver that purpose. That, in turn, I think will have the impact of getting support from the licence fee payer and to be able to reverse that trend. I don't think we should sit here and think, oh, the game's over. We can actually find...
I don't think anyone's suggesting that. What I'm asking is, if we're saying we need a long-term funding model, there's probably a finite range of options that can be looked at. So what are they? And then we can come to Tim on what are the short, medium-term mitigations for the decline that we're seeing.
Well, I know you've heard this before because I've looked at previous minutes, but the BBC has spent a lot of time discussing what alternative funding models are. There's some that we have, as it were, ruled out, and indeed the Enders report said a subscription model doesn't work in terms of public service. I'm talking about public service funding. I don't think the advertising model works either. So we are looking at different versions of a universal fee. Now, there are lots of different iterations of that. I know there's been some discussion here about a two-tier one where you have for public service. The board has not discussed this or made a decision. My personal view about it is I'm skeptical of a core and a service and then an additional, because that feels to me a bit like a subscription service and it'll have all the difficulties Enders has reported about subscription service. But I think we do need a fee. I mean, there are many options and we're still discussing it, whether it's a household tax or it's any other form of universal things. But the principles are clear, and I think which is its universality. And I know I don't want to get into a great discussion about universality, but I'm clear what I mean by it, which is that it should be paid for by the British public at large. We belong to the British public, and we should have content that provides value to every single licence fee payer there is.
Okay, can we come to Tim?
Does that help?
Should I? Yeah. I very much welcome the question because I think the risks are very high across the industry. And the amount of change we're going through means that every traditional revenue model some are borderline crisis, some are crisis. The BBC will be flat in revenue terms, licence fee income this year. So we're not in free fall, but we've got some erosion. You're going to get that with this level of competition. And to say that is, the wry smile I often have is, does the BBC and the top BBC team understand this? We're spending all our time thinking about how we give value to audiences on that money. What are the long-term revenue models? Now, it's not quite true to say the overall BBC revenue hasn't moved, by the way, because the commercial arm we've moved through a number of years from £1 billion turnover to £2 billion turnover with a decent margin, which helps. But it doesn't get you there. And your question is very well put, because you can push the commercial arm further. It is extremely helpful. But we're facing trillion-dollar companies. So what is the answer? The first is to know what you stand for and not try and do all things. Now, that doesn't mean you're not operating in all genres, but what I was trying to do in the speech earlier this year, so we are really focusing on these points of difference. Home to 99% of what the BBC makes is in the UK. That's different. For all our battles, impartial news, which we believe we deliver. We're not perfect, but we delivered it, and the teams are doing a sensational job on that through the election. We absolutely need to fight for that. How are we coping in the short term was your question. And by the way, it's worth saying, the BBC has had £1 billion taken out of it over the last decade plus. We haven't kept flat. We haven't kept flat funding. We've taken out £1 billion and we still remain at about 3.7 billion. So we've really disinvested in our public service broadcaster. Now, I happen to think the ways you addressed the issue you're talking about, and being provocative, it's not rocket science. We just had a fantastic July, by the way, in broadcasting terms. I know you may not feel the BBC is having the easiest of weeks at times, but actually when you take the Olympics, you take some of the dramas, Blue Light, Sherwood, all these things coming along, our numbers are very good. in the election, and I'm sure we'll talk about it because I know the chair's passionate about underserved audiences. We have really, really pushed hard. So the answer to your question is, one is we've taken as much cost as we can out that isn't delivering for audiences. And that's been brutal. The BBC Public Service, 2,000 people smaller than when I started. But it's still delivering 80% plus a week and nearly universal reach in a month. So we're defying gravity on that. The second strategy is to hire the best people, which is sensitive. But I know that sounds soft, but it's not. Because if you've got the best drama picker in the business and you're able to hire them from Netflix because the BBC is special, then you deliver performance. Yeah. The third thing is we use commercial income, and we use what you might call a not two-tier model, but a hybrid model with UK TV growing, all those things to try and do all we can to keep the scale of public service broadcasting. The next thing we've done is partner, so things like Freely, FreeSat, Freeview, to make sure the UK ecosystem, for want of a better word, is fighting and has strength. Going forward, we will need reform. As per the chair, we'll need reform of a public funding mechanism, and I would say publicly, whether that be scope, what it covers, what's it called. We need to do that work, and we're in the middle of it now, as opposed to just talking about it. We're in the middle of that work. The second thing is, I just want to emphasise, because I think this committee is incredibly important in this area, is the media bill said that public service broadcasters get appropriate prominence on digital platforms. If we don't know what that is and get that secured fast, we are going to not just put the BBC in jeopardy, but others as well. And remember, we've had the benefit, and we've chosen it as a society to put the 101 programme, 102, 103, those channel guides. At the moment, we are doing extremely well in digital and keeping relevant. We've had a fantastic summer for iPlayer, but there's a lot of risk. There's a lot of risk.
I think colleagues wait.
Thank you. We've got quite a lot of colleagues who want to come in on this area. Can I start with Lord Hall?
Yeah, I should declare an interest. I've worked with both the Chair and the Director General, and worked very well with both as well. Might I say I've got form, yes, or we've got form. It's a question which may therefore sound a bit arcane, but I don't think it is. Samir started off by talking about the importance of independence of the BBC. Spot on. One thing which happens in the case of this charter, 11 years, but it could be 4 years or 3 years or 5 years or whatever, is this charter renewal comes up, which is a time when the BBC, bluntly, is vulnerable. Would you be better off in taking the next 2.5 years up to 27 in, rather than saying we want a charter, we want to be established, say, like Channel 4?
Thank you for the question, Tony. Can I just say, I think you're absolutely right. The charter review, its time period, means that we are almost in constant review of the charter. There's a midterm review. We're constantly in this, I think, not very comfortable relationship with the government over charter, and it undermines and threatens our independence. I would absolutely welcome an exploration, or how can I put it, constitutional innovation when it comes to the relationship between the BBC and the government. That innovation could take the form of a new act. It has its pros and cons. There are other ways. I was told, that we are unique in having a royal charter. There are thousands of organisations. The Institute directors called it strange that we have a time period. Most have perpetual charters. Because we have a time period, we're forever in this dance with the government. So I think we should think about whether we should change the charter and remove the time period. Maybe we'll have to change the nature of it and make it more about core principles and have a framework agreement sitting underneath it. That may be more very. But I do think, Lord Hall, that thinking about the constitutional arrangement is very important. I think it's central to securing and strengthening the independence of the BBC. I can go slightly into more detail if you like, but I do think there's been a lot of discussion about the appointments to the board. I really share that view. I have a board of 14 execs and non-execs. Of the 10 non-execs, 5, including me, are appointed by the government. I'm not sure that's the right balance, and I think we should think again about it. Again, as I said earlier, the important thing about any constitutional innovation, it should strengthen the independence of the BBC. That is the heart of our reputation here and across the world. And I think that reputation has been damaged in the recent years as a result of the nature of the relationship and the leverage the government of the day has over the BBC. And we should try this time round to try and reduce that leverage and make our accountability to do with the public, the licence fee payer, which I think is partly what the mutualisation idea is about. Can the BBC be more, can the public be more directly involved and hold the BBC to account? And I think that's a good idea, and I certainly welcome an idea of dialing that up whilst we dial down the relationship with the government of the day and the BBC.
Just a brief question, a brief answer if you wouldn't mind. Some arts institutions, the government decides this is the person we want to chair. Some, the boards decide. Would one bit of independence or greater independence of the BBC be the board to decide who's chair?
Yes.
Their people among
Yes,
them.
would be.
Thank you.
Okay, I've got a lot of colleagues wanting to come in. I'm afraid not everybody will be able to, but I will allow Lord McNally to ask his supplementary question.
You mentioned the World Service.
Yes.
I know the Director General that was responsible. I was a minister of the government that fobbed the cost of the World Service onto the BBC. Perhaps it's a question to when we get ministers before us, but do you think that it would be better and fairer, given that the World Service isn't just a broadcasting organisation, but one of the most powerful soft power organisations that we have,
Yes.
that you should be removed that
I appreciate
responsibility?
your term fobbed off. I think that's correct. I think it's essentially unfair that the licence fee payer pays for a service that is to the government. But also, the World Service is an incredibly important instrument of soft power for the BBC. And being part of the licence fee, it has to take the cuts that the rest of the licence fee does. And that's not good either. And, you know, my home country is India, where I was born. The World Service is incredibly important all over the world. It's very important for the BBC, and it should be properly funded, and it shouldn't be dependent on the actions that we correctly take over the public service. And therefore, I do think maybe Tim would like to add about.
I think I said publicly in March, interestingly, that I haven't had any pushback, which is I totally agree with the chair. This should not be funded by the licence fee. I mean, also, I am understandably and appropriately under pressure on very limited resources to make sure every household and every flat in the UK, every house gets that value. And they are doing they're related, and there's definitely huge benefits for the UK news organisation to have the World Service. But if you take a language service, they do different things, and we should absolutely be funding that as the UK. The scary thing is that China, Russia, Turkey, the numbers are astronomical. The investment they're pouring into disinformation is very significant. At the moment, as we speak, there are real issues at play because we have a request into FCDO for a bit more money to see the wolf from the door next year, because the government puts in 104 million rand, we put in 250 of the licence fee. But all of it, if I'm being honest, is underinvesting. Even the Americans' Voice of America, which is nowhere near, I think, in terms of reputationally, although with all due respect to Voice of America doing brilliant work, the World Service, that's being funded to the tune of $920 million, that's, I believe, which is way in excess of the World Service. We have got to make a decision here if we're serious about this service or not. So we've got short-term requests for money in with the FCDO now, pre-charter, and we need that. And then I think when we come to charter, there's obviously, and even before that, we'd love to a situation where, frankly, this is properly funded by the UK government because it makes the cut, which it should do. Thank you for the question.
Okay, well, I think we're going to move on because I'm conscious of time, sort of moving away from what you've just been talking about to the audiences that are turning away. Baroness Healy.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I'd like to ask, what progress have you made on improving the way you engage people who are turning away from the BBC? And Dr. Shah, I'd like to ask you particularly, you said in March, can we stay relevant to the lives of the British people? And you expressed concern particularly about working class people. So I'm wondering how you're trying to address this.
Thank you. May I say, of my strategic priorities, this is right at the top. I think the BBC needs to do a great deal more in addressing the question of serving what we call the underserved audiences, the C2Ds. I think I've been in broadcasting for a long, long time, and this has been a chronic problem for the BBC. It's metropolitan bias and its programming and its power structures continue, in my view, to be focused in London. I think there's a lot of progress and a lot of work being done in moving production and programs out of London, but I think a great deal more could be done about power. Salford is a very good example of what I'm getting at. It's still not there yet, but the vision, and I'm thinking about making the underserved feel the BBC is part of them, it belongs to them, is that you can have a career in broadcasting without having to come to London. Now, I remember back in the day, and I was on the board when the Salford moved to place. We all had a vision that it would become Granada. Now, those of you older, I think most of you, will remember Granada. And Granada was an incredibly, and people thought it belonged to them. All classes, all culture, all community in that area. Similarly for Yorkshire, similarly for Tyne-Tees. We all know that. I think the BBC continues to feel like an organisation where the power base is in London and people outside feel, oh, it's over there. And we need to break that. We have a policy across the country. I think it's a great policy. We need to do more. There are lots of really good people committed to that. But these are hard things to achieve, but I want to put a lot of my energy in making that happen because it's enough. We can't keep saying we don't serve the C2Ds. And it's not just, may I say, just about a definition like C2Ds working. It's all about values, attitudes, the whole cultural thing. How far is that expressed? Now, apart from immediately, you're probably aware that the BBC does thematic reviews. I was involved in one. I was doing the migration one before I had to step down from it. The next one, which is currently underway, is about portrayal. And that is about how well does the BBC represent and reflect the lives of people across the country. It's going to be a very systematic, well-analysed, evidential-based work, and that will help us start building some policies and practices that will help begin to change that. But I do think the bottom line is to move the power out of London and to try and create these hubs where people living wherever, whether you're born in Truro or you're born in Middlesbrough, you can achieve in broadcasting without having to come to London to do it. That's a big, big task, but I would like to make real progress in that over the next few years.
If I may, we're really pushing on this, and as you can hear, I'm being pushed harder, and I think it's absolutely right. We've now 63 of 92 network TV commissioners are now working outside London. Big change. Yeah, so this is what we've got to do. We've got to change, and I think the chair's challenge is absolutely spot on. But if you look at the drama we deliver, you can see a real push. Yeah. In the elections, having things like local correspondence on the main news bulletins, all this is helping. And by the way, 84% on an average week across 23-24, 84% of C2DEs came to the BBC. So look, we've got, and I absolutely am not in auto defence here. I think we've got real challenges with some groups. What I would say is, I think there's something deeper in the industry itself. If you saw James Graham talking about the fact that 8% of people working in television come from a working class background. So there's been a lot of work done on diversity and a lot of metrics. But actually, I've always said that diversity of thought, different backgrounds, social mobility. Now, interestingly, I've really pushed on apprentices, but being open with you on what's not always working is we've moved the number up in terms of those coming. But it's still more convenient for people who have some kind of family income to support them through that process. So I think we've got to intervene on the people coming into the industry. Currently, the BBC, by the way, is at 20.8% of people coming from what you might, you can use a load of metrics, but basically it's what parental employment at 14. We're at 20.8. We've moved that number up. I want to get to at least 25, because part of this is also how people think, what their experiences are. And I think that, as well as the geographic point, is important for us at the BBC. I'm a bit more worried about the latter in some ways, because I can move people out, but actually you don't want to just arrive in an area and get the same, if I dare say, I'm in dangerous territory, but same type of people in terms of social demographics arriving in an office in Cardiff. And I think that's one thing I think we really have to motor on.
Can I ask you, Mr. Davey, I mean, how are you prioritising spending to meet the diverging demands of the different audience groups, especially the young, as they're moving away from
we're watching this like a hawk in terms of what groups and what programmes deliver to what audiences. And I think, interesting, when it comes back to the budget question, is I think absolutely you have some services like Radio 1 that are more youth-focused. But I have to say, what's really working is the sweet spot of taking your core activity, whether that be an entertainment program like Race Across the World, or you take the election and you say, I'm doing simple explainers. 47% of 18 to 24s claim to have consumed coverage of the general election results on social media. It's reshaping, so not diminishing standards, so you're into that whole dumbing down discussion. I'm not talking about that. But I'm talking about, we've got massive uptake among young audiences of simple explanations of manifestos. People are desperate for this. So I think it's reshaping our output at the core, rather than just saying, oh, we're going to do something cool on the side, which I think actually is not the essence of this. It's making sure the news of itself, the 6:30 news has always been brilliant at this regionally, where you've got a different tone of voice. And I think that's what we've got to do more of. And that is a big challenge in terms of how we take things forward. It's also very sensitive, because some people want to stick with what's there in tone and content. And I think it is getting more challenging. We find if you take an issue, a political issue, the level of understanding can be wildly varying between those people who have no idea of something and those people who are pretty well versed on it, and making sure we can, and we're really monitoring how we feed all the audience across that.
Okay, thank you. I know Baroness Whitcroft had a supplementary, but I would just say that I think some of what you're raising also connects to the questions that are going to be coming up about local news in terms of how that relates to hubs and what have you. But can I just check whether Baroness Whitcroft is happy to take it then, or whether you want to ask it now?
Very quick one. I would like to ask it now, if I may, Chair. Given the resources that you have to work out how to spend them. Some of us are concerned that news, and particularly news investigations, are going to be the victim. And I just wonder whether you could say how important you think national news and investigative news are. And I suppose Newsnight is something.
Well, they're the very centre of the BBC. And, we've put more investigative capability into local regions, for instance, now, and doing more work there. I think it's a justifiable concern, which is when we had investigative teams sitting with Newsnight. We don't want, just to reassure, we do not want to downgrade our investigative capability as a BBC. It's essential. I think we've had a good recent period in terms of a number of investigations. That is our central and core to the BBC, along with network news. I think there's just an organisational question about how much is attached to Newsnight, and there are pros and cons with that. You're attached to a linear slot to a degree. Newsnight has done some fabulous stuff. I mean, Birmingham Health Trust, that I could go on, but that it's been slightly different to some of the other investigative journalism. We're very sensitive to that and we want to protect it. But the short answer to your question is, under my tenure, we absolutely want to be leading the market in terms of investigative journalism. That does not necessarily mean that it's simply about the number of hours of programming you do. It's the quality of the journalism and making sure we've got the resources. But remember the earlier question. We've had 30% stripped out our budget. So you cannot do everything. And we've got to make some choices around quality over quantity sometimes, which is difficult.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
We're sort of sticking on the theme of news as we move to election coverage, and I'm going to go to Baroness Harding.
Thank you, Chair. So I think Ofcom published research today that shows that online sites and apps are now as popular as TV news for the first time. So I'm interested in, firstly, looking back, how did you address the challenge of serving an increasingly fragmented audience in the general election, and what did you learn from it?
I think what we did is just take one step back, which is what we did with the newsroom, which was sensitive, was begin to think about it in terms of, forgive the jargon, but story teams is where stories are developed and where you work your journalism, as opposed to having bespoke resources within every linear programme. That has been extremely sensitive, as you can imagine, because culturally, you know, you had your resources of each programme. The reason I'm answering it that way is because I think that allows you to say, okay, we've got a good story. So if you go to local now, and I'm very aware that we had these debates in terms of local resources, but I'm actually seeing stories flowing across onto my main app. The local news is on the main page of the news app. So we've moved our newsroom so that it is far less agnostic in terms of where it appears and how the story is formed. In the election, we also tested a number of formats on iPlayer. Some worked, some didn't, by the way, interestingly. So you can now see on iPlayer the newsreel. iPlayer's had a fantastic. And we're beginning to learn what works on iPlayer, because not everyone, and I say it with somewhat heavy heart, is going to get at 10 o'clock and sit for half an hour and watch the news. So the good news is we've seen very good numbers for the election. We have seen some decline in linear, to be very open. You can't avoid that. But actually, in terms of the online usage, that's really, really developing fast for us. The encouraging thing as well is, and it's difficult in measurement terms, this, because there's obviously the attribution question, which you're well aware of, which is once we're on TikTok and we're on Instagram, we want to bring people into the BBC as well. But we are definitely going out there. And I said, we were, you know, in online, we were the biggest news source for in the election by some distance across all providers, everything in online. So we've just been reshaping the output without affecting the quality. In fact, trying to take it up with things like Verify.
Verify is a fantastic lead through to my next question. You referenced earlier with regard to the state actors' misinformation and disinformation overseas. How much was the concerns, many of which, you know, we expressed here in this committee, about the potential risk of misinformation and disinformation in the election? How much was that an overblown concern, and how much was it real?
I don't know. Sorry, I haven't seen any data that really breaks down how far that went. I think slightly encouragingly, what we do know is we had massive uptake and particular response to verifies that said, let me outline the basics here. What are the claims? And I think there's a number of levels to this. There's malicious state actors trying to affect an election, and I haven't seen reports on that, or I don't know there's also just general noise where people cannot understand, where they can't see the wood for the trees, they can't see. We had incredible numbers, particularly of 16 to 34s and younger, coming to basic explainers. And I think we're going to double down in that area, and we're learning how Verify works. We put, by the way, heavier, serious reporters, One X Newsnight, into Verify, and it made a difference. And the election, I thought we were really robust. The other thing critically, I think, that is important is we give voice to every legitimate party, and absolutely make sure everyone who should have a voice has a voice. And finally, relating to earlier questions, we had an initiative called Your Voice, Your Vote, which really was very popular in terms of putting people's concerns. I think we took it beyond that, general vox pop, if you know what I mean, to concerns on the ground, what was happening, and that really responded, really delivered. I'm not sure I'm answering your question directly, because I think we need to see a bit more data. And I think we need to come up for air on that question and say just how influenced the election was by these things. One of the things I would say more generally, by the way, is the value of an institution like the BBC, the Ofcom code, all the things we do with public service broadcasting. I think that leads to, an election which was properly conducted, politicians coming to debates, being proper interrogation, You know, it's a very, very rigorous and proper democratic process, and I think it was well delivered.
Is there anything that you'll be doing differently in the run-up to the US election?
There's probably numerous things that the news team are going, okay, if we do this is a random example, not true, by the way, so it's a weird thing to say, but I just don't, I was listening to them the other day and they said, look, on iPlayer, if you put it at this time length, it just doesn't work. People aren't getting to it. So it's, you know, this podcast format works particularly. It's all in that. It's how you get it right for an on-demand world. We're
detailed
learning.
product design.
It's detailed product design, which you know in terms of time length, clip length, all those things. I think there's tension that, because we need to make sure it's of the depth and quality, and I know the news team really believe in this, and you aren't falling into the trap of, there is no doubt the whole market, and I made this point in the speech, the commercial market, totally understandably, and I say with no blame here, has to go after those clicks in a way the BBC can be slightly more strategic in terms of, you know, you won't see us writing lots of headlines that are questions to get you to click into it. So I think we'll stick our ground on that. Final thing is, I think verifying fact-checking probably be very important in the US election.
Yeah. If I may, one final question, Chair. Just one of the issues that came out of the general election was the accuracy of all the polls, or in fact the lack of accuracy of the polling. Do you think that all the focus on reporting of polls themselves risks affecting elections, and regardless of which party I think we probably all make an argument.
That's why the BBC is very careful, and we don't lead with polls in that way. We refer to polls. We're very careful about it. So the answer to your question is, there are significant risks with chasing an individual poll, particularly in an individual poll. Yes.
Thank you.
Just one other question on this area before we move on. Just it's sort of back to BBC Verify in certain respects. When Deborah Turnus was here before us earlier in the year, I raised a question with her then about criticism of BBC Verify in terms of its use of sources on Middle East reporting, and she responded by sort of basically sort of rather sort of dismissing it in a way that it was from a sort of, you know, typical type of critique, and we've had the reporting at the weekend about coverage of the Middle East. What I was just keen to understand is not to get into a discussion about the Middle East, but how is the BBC responding to these kind of challenges that it is receiving in terms of its reporting on the Middle East, regardless of which direction they are coming from?
May I answer that? The Israel-Gaza story is a very, very complicated story, and there are very strong emotions on both sides. The first thing I'd say is our journalists out there are doing a really fine job. I should say that they work in very difficult circumstances in Gaza, and particularly because we don't have access to it. I chair the Editorial Guidelines and Standards Committee, and that is part of the process where complaints are discussed and talked about and addressed. We have, over the last, in my time, just in 6 months, we have discussed the Israel-Gaza situation in various different ways many times to look at what the complaints are and the nature of the complaints and the balance of complaints. It's my view, I referred earlier to the thematic reviews. We're doing one this time on portrayal. We're now in the business, that will take its time and work its way through next year, what the next thematic review issue should be. And I definitely think that Middle East conflict is one area we should consider very seriously to be subject to a deep, systematic analysis of how we cover it. It's a very difficult story, and we get it. I mean, I received the letter with a substantive piece of work. It's gone through the normal process, through the complaints, it'll be treated properly. But in my time, and I've been in it for 40 years, this is one thing that has really resulted in lots and lots of concern on all sides. And I think it's the duty of the board and the BBC, because we play such a big role in reporting the Middle East conflict to the rest of the world, that we do take time out and approach and do an analysis a review of that coverage. And I think it'll be one of the ones we will consider very strongly as to be our next thematic review.
And just to remind us how many of these reviews you do a year? Is it 2?
Oh, no. The thematic reviews take almost the best part of a year to do.
Right.
One or two.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you. Baroness Week.
Great, Chair. Am I allowed to make a very quick point, which is, because I feel strongly about this, which is, I just want to reassure, because you've said, we take all the one thing of all the commentary I get slightly defensive about is not actually the criticism itself. Because I think that, by the way, our journalists are doing an outstanding job under the most ferocious pressure. The personal pressure, the lobbying, the reports from both sides. Now the trouble there is you go, well, it's all so much noise, we're not listening, and it's all equal, and we've got, by the way, we've got more complaints true that we're pro-Israeli on the pro-Israeli side than we have on the other side. There's a whole load of contextual factors around that. But what I would say is every complaint that comes in, and this is where I do dispute what's written, is taken seriously. I come from the view, and as leader of the BBC, I'm absolutely clear on this, that you kind of assume your critic's right until you've done the work. And we will look at that piece of research, take it seriously, in good faith. Every accusation we've had on the Arabic service, we've looked at. Now the issue is, not everyone agrees with the outcome. We've taken disciplinary action. We have people leave the BBC. But broadly, we are doing, I think, a very good job, and the research that we have into the overall public response is good, but that does not mean we're perfect. But I really would both stick up for our journalism, but also say we will treat these complaints seriously, we'll go through them, and we won't just be frankly in auto-defence, but also we will stand up for our journalists, and we'll stand up for people doing a good job. So that's the journey we're trying to walk. It's as fraught for institutions as there's a few of us around the table who have been through a few of these. This one's as difficult as they get, in my view.
Thank you. Baroness Whitcroft, we're going to move on to local news now, local media.
I want to take you away from international wars, but to local ones perhaps, because you've made clear your intention to move things across the country. That's great, but you can't please all the local publishers. And can you say something about where your relationships with local publishers are now? Some accuse you of trying to crowd them out. Is that fair? You're also working with them on the trainee scheme. So could you also say a bit about how that's working?
I think it's a relationship that is difficult at times because the first point I'd say is we've kept our investment in local. We've moved money around and that was very difficult, but I still believe that we needed to have an effective online presence, and the BBC and public service broadcasting shouldn't be trapped in one media. It should be able to do its business, and we provide a unique and valuable service locally that is utterly precious. And we are committed to that, by the way. We're committed to local radio. We're committed. I'd say we have a constructive, is probably the word I'd use, dialogue with the NMA. They do have concerns, and I think it's absolutely appropriate. I mean, on my watch, I've always tried to say that we want to see markets grow. We do have a strong opinion, which the NMA know, and we talk to them, and is that the structural declines in local press are present globally, and the BBC is not the key factor here. We're in the market, we're doing our business, but the truth is that if you look at advertising money, it's shifted away from print, and I understand that, and online is a much more competitive environment, etc., etc. So these things are very difficult. I do think it's a good topic of conversation to think where we can get further partnership. Obviously, we've got the local democracy reporting service. I think that's worked better than some of us thought it would, actually. I mean, I think it's really worked well. It's doing its business. I think actually a good topic as we look to the future is how we can further that partnership and how we can help each other bluntly, because no one wants to see the BBC's vision of success is definitely not that we're the only one in town. That is absolutely not how we want to work. We like a competitive, vibrant market, commercial, public. That's how it should work.
What is the role of the BBC and indeed any local news media now? Because it's often said that local politics gets no coverage at all, anywhere.
I mean, if you talk to if you go into any of our 39 local radio stations, or you go into, my local site here, you're getting quite a lot. You're getting some political coverage. What I think is difficult, and is really difficult for the commercial side, and they can speak for themselves, is having that coverage of, council meetings, and that's why the LDRS scheme is doing its work. Whether it's enough, whether it's big enough, could we do more of it, I think is a really good strategic question to address, because we've got to make sure that, I think is an incredibly important part of our democracy, that local politicians and local administrations are under the right scrutiny. I think the BBC's doing a great job on that, but it can't do it alone.
How are you keeping older listeners?
I think in terms of older listeners or older BBC, well, it's important that, because I think people often think move to online is an attempt to get youth. Yeah. If you look at over 60s, and I think it must be over 70, certainly over 60s are getting most of their news from online now. Yeah. So this is not simply lurching. We're doing our best with a flat budget in real terms. That's the answer to the question, which means if you're moving online, if you go to a local radio newsroom, it's worth a visit. And they're no longer local radio, I should say, they're local. And they are doing, we're putting reports onto radio that go onto the 6:30, which is precious to us, but they're going online. And that's how we've had to build a multimedia newsroom like any other media company or organisation. That has been very hard. What it's meant, because we've had such tight budgets, is what you've had to do is do less afternoon shows and all the things we've been through that have caused understandable angst. What we're trying to do is hold the listening while investing in online and pull that off. There are many that will be watching us as we do it.
Thank you.
Your story, you had a supplementary?
Yes, I've always regarded local radio as a potential jewel in your crown. And we look at local news, and some might say that it's in terminal decline, and the BBC could be the last person standing. Commercial radio has almost got rid of the sort of news element, and local newspapers, their circulation is plummeting. So my question, Tim, is this. How does the BBC help towards invigorating local news, local democracy? You have local democracy reporters. It always seems a bit bizarre to me that you actually give those to those newspapers which really thrive on what we call clickbait journalism. But actually there are other players in the market, like, these small internet-based newspapers. I've got one here, The Post.
Yeah.
And they seem to be the only people, not even the BBC are doing this, who are doing in-depth investigations. And we're talking about, 4 or 5 journalists, paid, young journalists, properly paid. They're doing one at the moment, exclusive, the mystery of 5 million loans to companies, etc. How do you help to invigorate local journalism? And it's not, I have to say finally, by consolidating and sharing, because it used to be that in the evening minorities could have their programmes, particular subjects could be looked at, and we've lost all that.
You've lost some of it. I think when you say potential jewel in the crown, it is a jewel in the crown. It's not potential, it is a jewel in the crown. And the BBC, and I need no convincing that locals are an absolute essential part of what the BBC offers. The issue, my job is not to say, if I may, we can agree on that. The issue and the exam question for me is, based on limited budget, what are the right choices to deliver that? And it's been very painful. I'd have loved to have funding to do everything, but there comes a point in which we've had to do some of those shares, because what I would say is local radio is incredibly important. The connection with the listeners is second to none, but its overall reach is about 10% of the population. Now, it may go to 15, but I don't think, and I say this with heavy heart, I haven't seen a forecast that said under any circumstances live radio is going to double its audience. It's just the way the market is moving. It's moving to your point, online. So I need to have the resources to make sure that we've got an online offer alongside radio, alongside the 6:30. This is not about sharing everything. There's certain things you do by media. we have invested and we put 130 journalists, more journalists into local. We've actually decided to create investigative journalism hubs, which, you know, honestly, get out, visit one of the hubs, they're amazing. They are doing that kind of work that you've just shown me. Final point, by the way, we've got a lot of work to do. I think the partnership challenge is a really good one. How could we work with those types of operations so that the BBC and our reach, because we've got a simple objective. Strategic objective for us is 50% of the population come to BBC Local. That's it. We could deliver that through television bulletins and radio. We cannot do that anymore. We need online. So it's a balance, but we don't need convincing of the strategic importance. It's critical. The issue is resources and I sound like it's management speak, but allocation of resources.
I'd like to come back on you, but thank you.
We might want to continue this outside the committee room because it's an important conversation.
Was there anything, Chair, that you wanted to add to what, or indeed comment on what Mr Davey has just said, just in relation to your vision, ambition for local hubs?
Well, I take in terms of just a point about local news. I obviously followed it. It's worth noting that as far as the board is concerned, this is part of an overall strategy which was presented to the board last year and approved, which is the move from, as Ofcom has said, from news, from linear channels to online. And what Tim has tried to do and was explained is do that move, because that's the strategic move, that's where the audiences are. And very interesting statistic, is it not, that over 70 or more what now see online than radio. The dynamics of the changing up is something we strategically need to move without leaving people behind. I think this is some of the tensions of making a move like that. But I just wanted to say the board is supportive of this as a part of our overall strategy of starting to shift our journalism online, because that's where the audience is.
All right. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for joining us today. We've covered an awful lot of ground. I think you've set out a very comprehensive shopping list for the new Secretary of State and the new government. And if any journalists have been watching us who have, instead of following the vote in the Commons on the winter fuel payments, I think you've given them quite a lot of news lines today as well. And I'm grateful to you for engaging with us. And I suppose I would just say in return, I would urge you please, Dr. Shah, to consider again about the transparency and the visibility of the board, particularly bearing in mind what you have put out on your shopping list today in terms of how you would like to see the development of the BBC, that critical need for the board to be visible in a way that it is seen to be representing all of the licence fee payers that are funding the BBC. But I'm hugely grateful to you all and to you both, and thank you very much for being here today. I'm going to bring this to a close. Order.